There are questions that seem like they should be easy enough to answer but aren't. Here's one that I get from time to time. Someone will ask me whether I think things are improving in the developing world. Usually they're asking about the money from foreign aid programs or the contributions that individuals make to charitable organizations. They just want to know if these things are doing any good. So they ask whether I see any signs of improvement in the countries I visit. All the questioner wants is a simple yes or no. Either things are getting better or they're not. But the only honest answer I can give is it depends. It depends upon what you look at. It depends upon the criteria you use to measure improvement. It depends upon what you mean by things getting better. I've been involved in this work now since 1984, the year of the Santo Domingo riots that we described in our last program. And since that time, developing countries have suffered many devastating setbacks.
One of the most dramatic has been the AIDS epidemic in Africa. In just 1 year, 2002, 2.4 million Africans died from AIDS, and an estimated 3.5 million new infections occurred. Throughout the developing world, if what you look at are the usual economic indicators that bank and credit rating agencies use, then virtually all developing countries are worse off now than they were in 1984. Political violence in the Third World, if anything, seems to be on the rise, not just in the Middle East, but in Asia, the Pacific, Africa. Again, just considering what took place in the year 2002. Hindu fundamentalists in Gujarat province in India killed over 1,000 Muslims. Maoist rebels in Nepal slaughtered 129 police officers, soldiers, and civilians. In Nigeria, Muslims angered by the staging of the Miss World pageant went on a rampage, leaving 200 people dead. In Africa, as civil war finally came to an end in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it broke out in Côte d'Ivoire. Al-Qaeda suicide bombings expanded to Kenya and Tunisia. The president of Colombia had to declare a large part of his nation a war zone. Sendero Luminoso, a Maoist terror group in Peru, which was thought to have been brought under control in 1992, once more emerged.
So are things getting worse? Well, the United Nations, organizations like the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, foreign aid programs like CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, they all point to a spectrum of improvements that have occurred in the developing world. Improvements in food production and nutrition, improvements in efforts to ensure that all children, in particular girls, have access to education.
And as girls become better educated, these groups point to a range of positive consequences. The children of a woman who has had as little as 4 years of education are more than twice as likely to survive infancy as are the children of a woman who can't read or write. So, as the education of girls improves, there has been a reduction in infant mortality rates. Many childhood diseases have been controlled. Approximately 80% of the world's children have been immunized against the 6 major infectious diseases, and other diseases, like smallpox, have been eliminated. Because more children are surviving infancy and early childhood, globally the birth rate has come down.
So, does that mean things are getting better? Well, like I said, it depends upon what you look at. It depends upon the criteria you use to measure improvement. Improvements have taken place in the developing world. What I find interesting is where they've taken place. Many of the most significant ones haven't occurred at the national level in developing countries, but at the community level.
For example, when I was with Andres Fortunato, he told me about the small community of Don Gregorio in the Dominican Republic, which had been destroyed by Hurricane David back in 1979.
We helped these people to rebuild the houses. We started with the help of the evangelical agency from Germany. And we created a factory to make concrete blocks. So many of the houses that you can see today they were able to rebuild it with the help of the YMCA. Since then, we started a program, education programs, and I will say 80% of the people who live in this community receive the breadth of the education and the YMCA programs. We still providing to the people medical clinic, dental service. We give toys to the people at the celebration of the Three Kings every year. We give the pregnant women pills, vitamins, and this is part of our service. And now we got involved in the HIV program, prevention programs.
Improvements such as these, improvements in the standard of living at the community level, are what matter most to ordinary men and women.
Really, people don't care much about their nation's current international credit rating. What they care about is the quality of their own lives. Are their children healthy? Do they have reasonable access to a decent standard of living, to food and shelter? These are the things that matter. And it turns out that the majority of resources and money going to promote this kind of development comes not from donor countries, but from the people of the South themselves. They've been the ones who have identified the needs of their communities and have sought effective ways to address those needs.
It doesn't take a large amount of money to improve the way people live. Some of the biggest problems that the people in the South had to deal with over the past few decades turned out to be issues which small, locally based cooperatives and non-governmental organizations like the Y were quite capable of dealing with. Improvements in sanitation, improvements in nutrition, providing basic health care and primary education, ensuring that people had adequate housing and access to safe drinking water.
So, yes, there have been overall improvements in the quality of life for people living in most developing countries. The major exceptions, however, have been the nations of sub-Sahara Africa. And they're an important and significant exception because they demonstrate just how fragile those improvements can be. Africans face many difficulties. Parts of the continent are vulnerable to periodic drought, which compromises its capacity for food self-sufficiency. Intertribal violence still rages in many regions. But the most overwhelming problem Africans face at the moment is the uncontrolled spread of AIDS. This disease is crippling the continent.
It is impossible to convey adequately that this is the most nightmarish plague the world has ever. The grandmothers, they bury their own children, and then they look after their orphan grandchildren. In the country of Zambia, your life expectancy is 30 years.
Elsewhere in the developing world, improved nutrition, improved health care for children, improved literacy have combined to contribute to an overall improvement in life expectancy. In Africa, on the other hand, life expectancy is falling, and falling dramatically. From an average life expectancy of 60 years only a short time ago to an average of 43 now, a drop of nearly a third.
There have been improvements in the quality of life of many people living in developing countries. But as the example of Africa demonstrates, those improvements could be reversed and may well be reversed if care isn't taken now. We've established earlier in this series that there's good reason for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in countries like Canada to be concerned about what happens in developing countries. What occurs in those countries affects not only their own populations, but us as well. We're linked to them environmentally, economically, even medically. So we need to be concerned about them, and we need to seek ways of helping them address the major problems they're facing. And by we, I actually mean you and me. I don't just mean our governments, and I don't just mean institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank. You see, government and other institutions respond to public opinion, and without the pressure of public opinion, they're often content to let things remain the way they are. Thank you. When people ask me what they can do about the things that I've been talking about in this series, I tell them that the most important thing they can do is be informed about the issues, because an informed public has the power to motivate government and other institutions to respond to situations which might otherwise be neglected.
For example, although activists have been talking about the importance of addressing environmental issues since at least the 1940s, worldwide, governments only became committed to doing something when there was a groundswell of popular opinion forcing them to do so. In 2003, the United Nations Special Envoy to Africa on the AIDS issue, Canadian Stephen Lewis, spoke out with passion about the situation on that continent. He called it genocide by complacency. And he called upon governments, in particular the Canadian government, to change the legislation protecting drug companies so that less expensive generic drugs could be made available in Africa. Public opinion responded to Lewis's eloquence, and petitions were collected and forwarded to Ottawa.
Government actually responded fairly quickly, promising to write the appropriate legislation. And while drug companies resisted at first because they wanted to protect their copyrights, when they saw the depth of public sentiment on this issue, they agreed to work with government to find ways to allow generic drug makers to provide inexpensive medicines for AIDS-stricken regions. What both government and the drug companies were responding to was public opinion.
It was also public opinion that drove the Millennium Jubilee Project, which sought to have at least a portion of the debt of the world's poorest nations canceled. And while promises made at the turn of the century and since still haven't been kept, the greatest incentive that governments and banks will have to comply with those original agreements will come from continued public pressure.
I've pointed out elsewhere in this series that I think that debt remains the single most important issue that needs to be addressed in the South. Any hope for future improvement, especially in the world's most needy countries, is compromised not only by the debt these nations have accumulated, but also by the conditions applied by their creditors, such as the structural adjustments we spoke of in our last program.
In that program, we demonstrated that much of this debt was incurred because banks, desperate to reduce large cash reserves, made inappropriate loans. The situation was then exacerbated by falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, and currency devaluations. The result, as we discussed, is that now more money flows from poor countries to rich countries than the other way around, a situation which entrenches inequity and poverty throughout the developing world. If the developing world could get free of the stranglehold of this debt, they'd be able to use their resources more effectively to promote social programs, poverty eradication, and environmental protection. Debt relief is a complicated matter. But there's another, much simpler step which donor nations like Canada could take to improve conditions in the South.
And that's simply to redirect their development assistance dollars. Although we pointed out that the way in which development assistance has been provided in the past wasn't always effective, the fact is that developing countries do need assistance.
Which is why we made a commitment to the United Nations that we would spend 0.7% of our gross national product, our GNP, on official development assistance. But in spite of that promise, our current ODA expenditure is only a little more than 0.25% of GNP. And, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, all too often Canadian assistance still comes with strings attached. Canadian commercial and diplomatic interest can still determine where our aid goes and how it's used. These criteria can overshadow the actual needs of people and countries to which that aid is sent. At the end of the 20th century, our official development assistance budget, excluding emergency food aid, totaled about $2 billion a year. But less than 20% of this amount was spent on meeting those basic human needs which have the most profound effect in improving the quality of life for ordinary women and men. Less than 20% was spent on things like primary health care, basic education, safe water, sanitation, and family planning. And yet, those are the areas which must be addressed if poverty and its effects are going to be eliminated. When we look at what have been some of the most significant advances made in developing countries over the last 40 years or so, we see that much of it has been the result of the work of non-governmental organizations. As a result of what these groups are doing within local communities, global nutrition, except in Africa, has generally improved. The rate of death for children under the age of 5 has been cut in half. Overall life expectancy has improved. Girls in primary and secondary school have increased from 38% of the female population to 68%. Immunization has decreased preventable disease. Access to clean water has improved. These and many more accomplishments have only been achieved because of the efforts of community-based non-governmental organizations in developing countries, which are at times supported by overseas development assistance programs such as CEDAs. And much more could be accomplished. Canadian NGOs have advocated a reform of Canada's official development assistance so that it more clearly focuses on the elimination of poverty in developing countries. This reform should include a timetable for renewed ODA growth, setting a target of, say, 0.4% of GNP, which would still be far short of our promised 0.7%. But even if there were no increase in ODA funding, major improvements in the way Canada's foreign aid dollars are spent could be achieved simply by redirecting them to the areas of greatest need and to the areas which have the greatest potential for success. And there is evidence that Canada's International Development Agency is already moving in that direction, with their special focus on the situation in Africa, for example.
And the area which is most grievously under siege is clearly the continent of Africa. 700 million people increasingly fighting for survival. This campus, this university has teaching divisions. It has nurses divisions. The two professional disciplines, by the way, which are probably needed more than any other on the African continent. And because of a language factor, you can't, of course, go to a country and leap right in. You can't teach a class, but you can train. You can train teachers. You can train nurses. You can train community health workers.
But we could still redirect more Canadian aid dollars from things like business development to the support of poverty reduction and the work of NGOs addressing basic human needs. As the challenge to provide inexpensive generic drugs to AIDS-stricken Africa has shown, government is responsive to public opinion on these matters. The more the public supports the concept of funding NGO activity in developing countries, the more likely it is that government will respond positively.
So, one of the most important steps that individual Canadians can take to help improve the quality of life of people in developing countries is simply to be informed about the issues and to make their opinions known to policymakers. There are other steps we can take as well, of course. As we become better informed about the issues, we'll discover that there are certain lifestyle choices that we can make that have a direct impact on people in other countries. To take a very simple example, consider that cup of coffee that I just had. It turns out that it's one of about 60 million cups of coffee that it's estimated Canadians drink each and every day. As we've pointed out elsewhere in this series, coffee is a tropical crop. It comes from developing countries. About 2/3 of the world's supply comes from South and Central America, where it's primarily grown by small-scale farmers who can be paid as little as 5 to 15 cents a pound for their product. By the time the coffee gets to the grocery store here in Canada, however, it can cost as much as $6 a pound. So where did the other $5.85 go?
Kelly Bolden operates a fair trade coffee cafe in Fredericton, New Brunswick.
Well, first of all, there are middlemen involved right in the countries where the coffee is produced who take a cut. There's also shipping from that end, getting the coffee out of that country to North American roaster. Then there are packagers and shippers and labelers and people that make cardboard boxes and all of those folks along the way who certainly do make a cut and dig into that money that otherwise could have maybe gone to that farmer. I buy coffee from a company called Just Us, and their literature and facts and figures are the ones that I know for sure are true, so that's what I'm going to quote to you. Their farmers are paid, or the farmers they buy from are paid on average $2 Canadian a pound, which is over 10 times more than the conventional business pays the farmers. They also donate a portion of their profit before tax to the farmers and to the communities. So instead of having a cycle of poverty that's perpetuated, there's actually a cycle of prosperity. Money goes back into healthcare and education. Farmers are able to pay their expenses, cover their expenses, and actually have some money to work with and continue to promote sustainable and organic farming in their communities. Well, you do pay a bit more for fair trade coffee. Generally, statistics show that, just trying to think, on a retail level, like if you were to go into a grocery store and buy a pound of fair trade coffee, it would probably be closer to $12 for a pound, but you're getting premium, organically grown, absolutely fabulous product. On the other hand, conventional business and our other internationally known brand name coffee, you're probably going to pay maybe $5 to $7 a pound. So you are going to pay less. But as most of us in the business who've sampled a lot of these different coffees, the higher quality of the fair trade coffee is much more, to us, certainly much more worth the extra price. But again, the fair trade people are community minded. They see the idea of sustainable farming and helping people in these communities as a far more important avenue than having huge profits. They're certainly in business to make money. You have to make money in order to continue, but you don't need to make the huge profits in order to continue with business in a prosperous way.
We should be just as concerned about the conditions under which many of the products that we buy each and every day are produced. One of the major business stories in 2003, the year that these scripts were first developed, was the closure of all the Levi Strauss factories in North America. The jobs were being exported overseas to countries where the cost of labor was less expensive than it is here. That doesn't just affect workers in Canada and the United States, it continues to be an exploitation of workers in other countries. But corporations are just as responsive to public opinion as our governments, if not more so. And so one of the ways in which consumers can respond to this situation is by demanding that the clothing they purchase meet what are called no-sweat guidelines. No-sweat purchasing policies have been implemented by schools and universities in Canada. The YMCA, where I work, brought them in 2002. Even some municipal governments in Canada have implemented them.
Jessica Hamer and Jason Melanson are students at the University of New Brunswick in St. John who helped implement a no-sweat policy on campus.
It's just basically the fact that universities are institutions of higher education that kind of set an example. It's important as far as society is concerned, and it's really moving for social change. As far as if it's going to cost anything to the university, we've been kind of looking mostly into the garment industry, so I'm not very familiar with the other industries. But as far as the garment industry goes, there is already evidence that it's kind of a financially neutral territory. It's not going to actually increase the cost to students to buy sweatshirts at the bookstore or anything like that.
These are not small matters. The choices we make as consumers do have an effect on people in other countries. Governments and corporations do respond to public pressure. There is no way of knowing for certain how I would respond 10 years from now if someone were to ask me the question we began this program with: have conditions improved in the developing world over the past decade? But in all probability, the answer would still be it depends. It will depend upon whether we're able to control the AIDS epidemic in Africa. It will depend upon whether or not we're able to reduce the crippling debt that developing countries are struggling with. It will depend upon whether developing countries can gain greater sovereignty, whether they can set their own development priorities and guidelines. It will depend upon the nature of the trading agreements reached between rich and poor countries. It will depend upon the controls that can be placed on multinational corporations. And it will depend upon the political will of nations like Canada and the United States to make a commitment to bring about change, to set reasonable goals for international development assistance, and their willingness to ensure that those funds reach the poorest countries
and go to the programs which most effectively address the needs of the poor. It will depend upon lesser developed and more developed nations working together to ensure that all the people of the world have reasonable access to a decent standard of living and the satisfaction of basic human needs. There's no guarantee that any of these things will happen, but they could and they should.